So Sky News has an interesting reputation to me. They seem to be perceived by overseas audiences, anyway, as being fighting the good fight. But you'll see in this video that I'm going to stop and comment on that they clearly have an agenda above all others that would seem to be this war agenda. So while they appear to be a voice of reason by calling out woke politics gone mad, the LGBTQI stuff, all the problems with the voice to Parliament, and seem like they're very sensible on other issues, we see here very clearly in this video what the agenda is that you can't touch. They've got talking points, and yeah, they intend to drive us to war with China.
Let's hear from the Shadow Minister for Cybersecurity, James Paterson, who joins me live from Melbourne. First, I'll play part of what Paul Keating said today.
They got right knocking Hughes off over conscription. Curtin got it right in knocking Churchill off over the troops from Burma back to Papua New Guinea, back to Kokoda. Arthur Corwell got it right when he opposed the Vietnam War. Simon Crean got it right when he said we shouldn't be sending troops to Iraq. But this one is where we break the winning streak. The two principal people on the left in Australia are now Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong. And of course they would say, the old left, oh, that mob in Sussex Street, you can't trust them. But God, if you look at me or Laurie Bratton or Leo McClay, we look like Bolsheviks compared to them. Bolsheviks.
So what did he say that is particularly controversial here? Well, they just don't like somebody going off of the talking points. So Iraq that was the right idea, was it? Vietnam, that did good things for us. No, yeah. Watch the spin.
Well, Anthony Attila Albanese to Paul Keating, James Paterson. What did you make of all that?
Good afternoon, Andrew. Well, even by Paul Keating's standards, this was an utterly extraordinary performance at the National Press Club today, an unhinged spray at his friends and former colleagues in the Labor Party and the government, an attack on our closest allies and friends, the United States, the United Kingdom, but also India. Previously, he's attacked Japan. In fact, there's only one country in the world that he appears unwilling or unable to criticise, and that's China. When Mr Keating's made contributions like this in the past, Anthony Albanese has often dismissed them by saying Mr Keating's entitled to his views, like he is just some random person in the street, and perhaps they might send out an assistant minister or a backbencher to more comprehensively respond. I think this demands a much more serious response. Paul Keating is not just a random person in the street. He's not just a former Labor Prime Minister, but a Labor Party legend, admired by many of the current Labor MPs, senators and ministers. And this demands a senior response, a response from the Prime Minister, from the Foreign Minister, from the Defence Minister, comprehensively setting out how they depart from his thinking. Okay. Otherwise, people will be thinking that there is some sympathy for these thoughts.
All right, well, hang on. Malcolm Fraser.
So what strikes me, and I am not a fan of Paul Keating, he gave us a superannuation scheme, which is just theft by another name. But Sky News pretends to be holding Albo's feet to the fire, holding this Labor government's feet to the fire, and then you've got a former Labor Prime Minister coming out and saying that they've got this deal shockingly wrong. Look at what's on the line. And Sky News defends Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong. So what does that tell you about the agenda that's really sitting behind it all? It's fine to give the plebs the sense that somebody's on their side and talk about how nonsensical a lot of these woke agendas are. But when it comes to the nuts and bolts of driving us to war with China, it's all the way with Joe Biden.
Fraser used to bag John Howard. I don't remember John Howard coming out against Malcolm Fraser at the time.
I think the last thing that anyone would criticise the Liberal Party of doing is being too respectful of Malcolm Fraser's legacy. I think, in fact, Malcolm Fraser and his supporters have the opposite view, that we were, in fact, too critical of his views in his post-parliamentary life. We set out very clearly the ways in which we disagreed with him. We were unashamed of doing so. And if one of our living former legends, like John Howard, came out and made some unhinged comments like this, I can assure you we would be out there very clearly explaining how we disagree. Thankfully, John Howard doesn't behave like that. Our current living former Prime Ministers don't behave like that, but Paul Keating does, and he hasn't been called out by the senior levels of the Labor Party, and now is the time they must call him out.
What's inspiring him, do you think, Paul Keating?
I don't want to speculate about his state of mind or about his motivations, only he can speak to that. I think it was very telling, though, when the journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald, Matthew Knott, put to him an opportunity multiple times to criticise the Chinese government for their treatment of Uyghurs, and he refused to take up that opportunity multiple times, and then went on to say that the treatment of Uyghurs is somehow in dispute. It is not in dispute. The United Nations has said this may constitute crimes against humanity. Human rights groups have said this might constitute genocide. There is ample evidence on the public record that we know that millions of Uyghurs have been interned against their will, that their culture has been subjugated and destroyed by the Chinese government, that they are being persecuted in one of the worst human rights abuses that we've seen in the 21st century. So for him being unwilling to call that out, and in fact to call that into question, is a very dark stain on his public reputation.
All right, well, that was...
So we start to see how murky this gets, right? All of a sudden we're talking about Paul Keating's opinions about China. Like I said, I'm not saying Paul Keating's a good guy. I suspect maybe he's actually got a health scare or something, and he's thinking, well, maybe I might do something right. I mean, I did serve a foreign occupying power in my country, so maybe I can actually do something decent before I die. But so now we're talking about Paul Keating's opinions about the treatment of the Uyghurs and the Chinese government. And I don't know what's going on there. It seems like it seems like it's horrendous. I'm not saying China is the good guy. But we're talking about spending like $380 billion to get nuclear-powered submarines from the US that we'll get in decades' time. Meanwhile, the US has, or it would seem that they are likely to have nuclear weapons stationed in Australia. Recently, Penny Wong got asked by another senator whether the US is actually storing or flying nuclear weapons over Australia, storing them here. And Penny Wong said, no, well, there's a don't ask, don't tell policy. So, you know, we're mature enough not to ask the question. So anybody asking a question of, hey, wait a minute, China is so evil, as we're just, as James Patterson's just telling us now, how they treat the Uyghurs, etc. But we're happy to have nuclear weapons and become a nuclear target for these this psychopathic regime. It doesn't mean, yes, it's just so, yeah, you see how murky it is, where they're playing politics, but not, the question isn't, are we making ourselves a nuclear target? Are we selling our children into debt yet again to buy submarines that we might have in like 2 decades' time? Will the US dollar be around then? Will the United States be around then? Will we be around then, when we're clearly making ourselves known as a threat to this evil regime, China? And these, yeah, they're discussing it as though it's just all theoretical. As though this isn't real. It's not becoming a nuclear target. you see what the real agenda is. That it's said and done. We saw from their programming video get us used to the idea of we're going to war with China. So just suck it up and enjoy. And we go into debt as well. There's double whammy.
Paul Keating. This was Kevin Rudd with SBS French talking about AUKUS 2 years ago. Have a listen.
What is the reason for the deception? I don't understand it. Was it to simply produce a grand surprise for Australian domestic politics that we were now going to enter the big league with nuclear-powered submarines in partnership with the British and the Americans? I suspect there is a domestic political agenda at play, which is for Morrison to make himself look big, important, and hairy-chested. I am concerned about the long-term impact that has on Australian sovereignty on our own naval forces, because there are times when we will disagree with the United States. So as an ally of the United States, you don't necessarily end up agreeing with the Americans on every element of strategy. Sometimes our American friends get it wrong.
Sometimes our American friends get it wrong. Okay, that was 2 years.
So we start to see how they use politics for a smokescreen of what the real agenda is. Because Kevin Rudd makes some good points there. Once again, I think he's a total douchebag. But what he's saying is you do not have to do what Big Brother tells you to do in order to be an ally. So why are we signing on for more debt? We can't even see the ledger. We don't know how much debt we have. We're more debt than an asset at this point, clearly, and we keep paying for it. And this is just the smoke screen, the bread and circus to get you to look at, oh, it's Labor versus Liberal, and the problem here that James Patterson is saying is that Labor Party haven't called out Paul Keating on his comments. Not actually, and then talking about Paul Keating's previous statements about China, blah, blah, blah. Right? You want to actually bury the elbow government? Here you go. Keating opened a door for you. He's saying this is a terrible deal. He's hinting at the destabilizing nature of this, the danger of this. And what does Sky News do? They direct the attention to, oh, well, the current Labor government should do more to say that Keating's comments we don't stand by. Like, it's just talk. It's just talk. I'm literally living in an insane world. They're talking about the comments, or the lack of comments, of current politicians when we're talking about nuclear war, the potential for nuclear war with China. It boggles my mind. And I am heartened in that the YouTube comments seem to show that the average viewer is saying, hey, wait a minute here, Keating's never sounded more sane.
Years ago, is this the best appointment Anthony Albanese could have made as Australian ambassador to the US, James Patterson?
Kevin Rudd is clearly in a very different category to Paul Keating. I wouldn't suggest that they are in the same ballpark at all, but you are right to draw attention to those comments, because neither Mr Rudd nor the Prime Minister nor the Foreign Minister who have appointed him to be our ambassador in Washington DC have explained whether or not Kevin Rudd has changed his view about these issues. And in the Australian government, there will be few people more important than our ambassador to Washington DC in the successful implementation of AUKUS. He will be in many meetings that will be pivotal to making sure it succeeds. Now, I assume he probably has changed his mind. I assume perhaps he was over-egging his criticism for domestic or partisan intent. But actually, it's incumbent on him and those who appointed him to come out and explain that, and to reassure the Australian people that he is fully supportive of the implementation of AUKUS, and that he will fulfil his responsibilities as ambassador to do so.
Once again, reassure the Australian people? about who's the biggest threat here. I see Australia becoming a nuclear target, and I see these clowns working for a foreign administration, a foreign power in our land, acting like reassuring the Australian people, reassuring the slaves, the wards, the debt servants, that we are behind the AUKUS deal. More debt. The AUKUS deal is more debt for technology that will probably be outdated by the time it arrives, if it ever does, if the US dollar still exists, if Australia and the United States still exist. In the meanwhile, we've made it clear our war footing with China, a nation that Patterson is telling us are evil and dangerous. So are the Australian people that retarded? Thankfully, the YouTube comments tell me they're not quite that retarded. But Sky News is showing us who they really serve.
All right, well, interesting you say that. Arthur Sinodina said earlier in this program, the outgoing ambassador, a former colleague of yours, that there wouldn't be a cigarette paper between the government's position on AUKUS and that of Kevin Rudd going forward.
Well, I hope that Arthur's right. And Arthur mentioned in that interview with you that he's met with Kevin Rudd more recently, and maybe Kevin has made that point to him directly. But he hasn't made that point publicly. He hasn't reassured the Australian people that he has changed his mind from 2 years ago. Because let's remember, Kevin Rudd wasn't just critical of the announcement of AUKUS. He wasn't just critical of the handling of the French relationship, for example. He was actually critical of the substance of it. He said it could compromise Australia's sovereignty. That's a very fundamental critique of AUKUS. And if he still believes that, he's not an appropriate appointment for that role. And if he doesn't still believe that, then it's incumbent on him to say so, or for the Prime Minister or Penny Wong to clarify, but none of them have done so far.
Well, finally, I wanted to ask you about the cost of AUKUS, and Bill Shorten was on earlier with Simon Love saying hands off the NDIS. NDIS savings shouldn't pay for defence. What do you make of that?
How do we fund this suicidal endeavour? This is the question? It's just, here you go. Here you go. You can see, point blank, Sky News has run about a dozen to 20 pieces in the last 48 hours on how Paul Keating's got it so wrong. So you see the agenda is AUKUS goes ahead and we're pushing China because we're doing what we're told. We've always been at war. And we go where the US tells us to go, even when the US is collapsing in front of our eyes. Look at the BRICS nations, Iran, now moving away from the US dollar. And we just sign up more debt, make sure our children don't have a future. Clearly there is an agreement that we don't get to see. There's nothing in here about what our actual security interests might be. But just, no, $380 billion for some submarines in 20 years, if they arrive. But it's more debt. And we're making an evil psychopathic enemy, we're making a target of ourselves. But no, this is important what Kevin Rudd says. It's important what the politicians say to make their point clear. Is it important not to your representatives, allegedly, of the people of Australia? Is it not important to not make them a nuclear target? To not go even further into debt? Paul Keating's comments were so mild. But you see, they're leaping to the defence of the war agenda. Politics is just a smokescreen for it.
Well, no one is suggesting that NDIS savings should pay for defence. AUKUS is going to be a very expensive investment, but a necessary and worthy one, and it will have to be paid for. And the government will have to make some tough decisions about how to accommodate this spending. And so far, they've shown absolutely no willingness at all to say no to any of their core constituencies when they come to them to ask for money. They say yes to increased funding to the NDIS, to aged care, to healthcare, to childcare.
Doesn't Peter Dutton say, yes, you can save with the NDIS? And doesn't that kind of link to the defence spend then?
No, I think that's been misinterpreted. In his interview with Sarah Ferguson on 7:30 the other night, he was asked whether he'd be constructive about identifying savings. He pointed to his budget reply speech where he offered bipartisan support to the Labor Party to get the spending pressures in the NDIS under control. He wasn't saying that that was an area that we could cut to pay for defence. He was using that as an example of how we have been constructive and bipartisan to help the government find savings. Of course, if the government believes there are savings that need to be made in the defence portfolio or anywhere else, we're very open-minded to hear their case as to how that can be made. But so far, this government has identified virtually no savings at all, and they've said yes to everyone who comes to them asking for money. And this is going to require tough choices, and it is not clear that this government is willing to make those tough choices. We'll get a sense of that in the budget in May, but the jury is still out.
James Patterson, I have a slight feeling that I've just seen some hairs be split, but that's fine. Thanks very much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, so Sky News wants the Liberal Party to run the war machine. China uses economic warfare and infiltration. It is not likely to attack us. It's the same old playbook. And you just see how they use the politics to get you not to look at the fact that they both want to run the war machine. Does it make a difference who's running the war machine? When your children could be conscripted to go to war, to go to a pointless war, when it's the warfare is it's in the finance. $368 billion to get submarines in 20 years' time. Why? Why? The money. The money and the... Don't question it. Just look at this. Yeah, it's... Yeah, I don't know. I can't, I haven't seen a more clear-cut example of how they play on your emotions, and they speak very strongly about Lydia Thorpe or about woke LGBTIQ stuff. But the nuts and bolts of it is you don't stop, you don't question the war machine. And then, more debt. And, your kids go and die for no reason. So get off the ship.